does not very fast. Hoping this finds you well. Sergeant says I'm doing fine.
Hello and welcome to Haden Hill House. Cheers! Now rationing was in place throughout the war and also afterwards as well, and went on into the 50s. And it was brought into play because we just couldn't get the food that we wanted to from abroad anymore because of wartime. So we were going to have to grow or produce as much food as possible ourselves. And to ensure it went round all the population, food was rationed. So everyone was issued with a ration book like this one, which had coupons inside. And you would take your coupons along to the shop and they would cut them out, so you knew you'd had your ration for that particular week. This ration book shows clearly that rationing went on well into the 1950s, so even if you were a child born after the war, you still could have experienced quite a bit of rationing. Now we're going to look at some basic items and how much you might have got during the war, although amounts did change throughout time, but it'll give you an idea about how difficult it could be to make things stretch and be able to feed the whole family. But before we start, of course, if you're actually cooking or doing anything with food, you should wash your hands. And this is carbolic soap. Give your hands a good scrub with that. It's quite smelly, but it will certainly get your hands extremely clean. So very good. I wish you could smell it. So the first thing we're going to look at is eggs. A very everyday item. How many eggs might you expected to have in wartime rationing? Well, the answer is 1. So everyone would have been allowed 1 egg per week, which isn't much really, is it? If you wanted boiled eggs for breakfast, or particularly if you wanted to make a cake, if someone was getting married or it was a birthday. So you would have to save up your coupons if you wanted to make a cake. Or you could try and persuade other people to give you their coupons, although this wasn't allowed. You could also have had dried eggs instead. This went a bit further, and this is about 4 weeks' rations of eggs. So it would go further than fresh eggs, but certainly wasn't as nice, but it may be okay to use in certain recipes, and it was a reasonable substitute. The other thing you could do is, of course, keep your own chickens, and many people did keep chickens in the garden for eggs, as eggs were very nutritious and made a good supper, particularly for the children, who could have a piece of bread and some dripping that came off the meat and maybe an egg. So eggs were a great source of nutrition for people, so they wanted to get hold of those. Now, what about tea? That's another very everyday item, isn't it? Many of you probably drink quite a few cups of tea, or if not, cups of coffee. So how much tea would you have been able to have in any given week? Well, you'd have been able to have 2 ounces of tea. That's this much, not very much really, but let's have a look how much that is. Now, in the 1940s, tea didn't come in tea bags. Tea came as loose tea like this. It smells rather lovely, and you'd have been able to have 2 ounces of loose tea. How much is that in tea bags? Because today we often drink more tea bags. Well, it is 14 tea bags. So that's 2 cups of tea per day. Not many really for most people. So you would have to make your tea go a bit further. You probably use the tea leaves several times. So you might have had weaker tea, but at least it was hot and it was wet. And there was a bit of tea in there as well. So you may have had to make your tea eke out a long way. So let's put our tea back. What about for our younger people out there? Well, what about sweets? Well, you're allowed 2 ounces of sweets per week as well. Probably not that many sweets, kiddies. So let's see how many sweets 2 ounce is. I've got some good traditional mint humbugs here. So let's see how many there is. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just 6 sweets per week. These are quite heavy sweets. So you might get more of other sweets, but it's not much, is it, children, that you would have to make those go a long way. So you would really savour and enjoy the little amount of sweets that you were able to have. Now, what about vegetables? Well, vegetables weren't rationed, but they were quite hard to get hold of because, of course, everybody wanted them. So people started to grow their own vegetables, and the Dig for Victory campaign came in. And this meant that any bits of grass that weren't being used were dug up and used to grow vegetables. In fact, even here in Haden Hill Park, part of it was dug up to grow vegetables. So grass verges, allotments, gardens, any bits of grass were used to grow more and more vegetables. And of course, the Women's Land Army was created to go and help farmers to produce more vegetables and things like wheat for bread out in the countryside as well. So let's have a look at some of our vegetables and fruit. Some nice traditional vegetables there. Can you see cabbages, onions, carrots? But can you spot the fruit or vegetable that shouldn't be in my pot? Well, of course, it's the banana. Bananas were very exotic, and of course, they were definitely off the menu in wartime Britain. In fact, it was many years before children were allowed to eat bananas again, and people spoke of how exciting it was to have something as exotic as a banana. So can you imagine getting very, very excited about eating a banana? But there were plenty of things like apples and pears to go around, so people ate lots and lots of vegetables, particularly as it was quite difficult to get hold of meat. There were lots of recipes in recipe books that would help people to create recipes without meat. People didn't really think about vegetarian dishes or vegan dishes without meat in those days. So it was quite a new thing for many people. So lots of recipe books would help people how to make the food rations go a long way, but also how to save fuel and make sure that they weren't using too much fuel when they were doing their cooking. So there was lots of advice to housewives on how best to feed their families. So we've talked about vegetables and some luxury goods. What about meat? Well, meat was rationed too, and you didn't get a lot of meat at all. If you wanted some nice, fresh, lean meat, you only got a very, very small amount. So you may have opted for something like this. This is corned beef. So this rather large tin would have been 2 weeks worth of rationing for an adult. So if you imagine half of that tin is your entire week's worth of meat that you're allowed to eat. So it's not actually that much, is it, if you think of all the meals you might have. So people might have corned beef hash, which is corned beef mixed in with potato and turned into a big hash, essentially, and put together as a nice nutritious meal. You might have that with some green vegetables if you could get hold of some. So it was a little bit dull, but it was quite nutritious. So you may have gone for something like corned beef rather than nice fresh lean meat. Also, you might have kept your own. We've talked about chickens, of course, for eggs, maybe even meat. People sometimes kept pigs, but a lot of people kept rabbits like this. Well, not like this actually, because it's been dead a while, it's a bit stiff. This was a wild rabbit, and people kept domestic rabbits. So if you've got a rabbit at home, a pet rabbit called Floppy or Flupsy or Fluffy or whatever your rabbit's called, then that's the kind of rabbit that people kept in wartime for food. So they'd have kept the rabbit in the garden, and then of course they'd have had to kill it themselves, skin it and eat it. But remember, at a time when there's very little food around, you'd have been quite willing to do that. There was very little meat around, and everything was rationed, so you had to make your food go a long way. So if you could grow something or you could rear some meat, then you would do so. Times were hard. So that's about everything that we've talked about then today. So it's time for me to go. So cheers.
so. Run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, run, run. Run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, run, run. Bang, 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 bang goes the ball.